So, those of you who have heard me preach a few times now probably are kind of used to me stepping through the passage bit by bit and kind of unpacking it almost segment by segment, which I'm still kind of going to do because I can't fully escape that. But I was reading this one and I was like, this is like a chapter and a half of the Bible, and there's probably about 17 different ideas. And in lieu of being here for the next 90 minutes, I've had to take a slightly different tack. So we're going to do a couple of things tonight. First, I want to talk about food, manna and quail, and water from a rock, so food and water. Then I want to highlight the three tensions that I see in this passage and see if in those tensions we can find a message for us today. I'm basically going to ignore everything else, just heads up now. But before we start that, I do need to say that I guess contextually in this story, or the backdrop to this story, is the story of Exodus. And last week we heard a really powerful message about the crossing of the Red Sea. And in our minds, we kind of think, whoa, drama, I just get the Prince of Egypt in my head from a child, the giant walls of water and people walking through the middle. So I'm not going to get into too much of that, but Michael Dean did mention and talk about the other element of the backdrop to this is a people who complain. And a people who choose as their narrative that they tell themselves hundreds of years later, we're the ones who complain. So if you haven't seen last week's sermon, please go back and watch that. It was absolutely brilliant. But I do want to go on the record and say I think I kind of get it. I get it, in part because I flew to Ballina last Monday, and for 3 whole days in the lead up to that trip, I was telling everybody that I saw about Bob's Tacos. And I was desperate for Bob's Tacos. And if you haven't had Bob's Tacos in Ballina, it's worth the 7.5-hour road trip. It takes me back to the best memories of when I was living in the LA area and the amazing Mexican food that you have available there. And there is nowhere in Australia that compares to Bob's Tacos, in my very humble and un-foodie educated opinion. But I got there and it was closed. They don't open on Mondays. And I'm still kind of reeling and devastated and whining about the fact that I missed out on Bob's Tacos. And so I'm that's somewhat more trivial than having water to keep you alive. And so I'm yeah, I get it, I guess. And maybe in proportion to the other stories of what God was doing, the Israelites' complaints do feel a bit petty, and it's easy for me to kind of judge that pettiness. But then in proportion to the kind of things that I whine and whinge about, I'm okay, so food and water. A lot of these stories in Exodus are set with the idea or the concept of miracle. Last week's one of crossing the Red Sea being one of those giant, dramatic, huge, supernatural miracles that are almost unbelievable, or as many people think, actually unbelievable. And we get all the dramas of these miracles and all the dramas of the supernatural. This week's a little different. There is actually some quite natural and ordinary explanations for the miracles that we see. Rather than the provision of God through the dramatic, we have the provision of God in the everyday, which is not how I had read that story in the past. Because to me, it kind of still reads as bread falling out of the sky. And I had always had this image of Moses hitting the rock, and then it's not just a little trickle, but this giant river of water flows from the rock and satiates the thirst of hundreds of thousands of people. But a little bit of study under the surface reveals something quite different. So the bread from heaven, the people call manna. And the fact that it came with the Jew is a little bit of a hint to something that those of us living in Australia may not have a full grasp of. It suggests that God's miraculous provision actually uses a very natural process, namely aphid poo. Well, a secretion of small aphids would be the nicer word to use, that feed on the sap of tamarisk trees. When it hardens and falls to the ground, it can be collected and used as a sweetener or as a calorie source. It would come with the dew because the aphids would eat overnight, poo out sweet little bread particles, and then be collected by ants and insects the following morning. And people throughout the morning would also collect it and use it in food source as a sweetener. And then over time, it can turn rancid or go off, or flies also enjoy it. Flies create maggots. And so it's sort of like a temporary food source that you grab and you use in the moment. And in this moment, God says, in response to your cry of hunger, look to the aphid and the food it supplies you. It is right here all around you, sustenance for the journey ahead. Now, there is some elements of miraculous still in this story. The volume of aphid secretion that is necessary to feed a nation of people is probably a pretty intense amount. Whether you take that literally or whether you think maybe the author of the story is talking to future generations and teaching them a life lesson about how God even provides for you when you walk in the wilderness, I'll leave that in your very capable hands. And then there's the fact that it kept for, 2 days every Friday. It also sounds a bit crazy and weird. But as far as teaching trust and resilience and rhythms of rest and Sabbath, it's a really great story. Quail. They're a migratory bird. Migratory birds migrate, sometimes through deserts. In this particular part of the world, often through this particular desert. Again, we have a story of something that is quite ordinary, a resource that is not necessarily abundantly always there, but a resource that is not unusual to find in that location. And so Moses, through God, is able to say, look to the aphid, look to the migrating bird. Here you have resource that maybe is different to the resource that you are remembering or complaining about not having, but it is resource enough. So 2 examples of ordinary, everyday resources that Creator God provides to God's people. The instructions given around it: learn to live on enough. Regardless of whether they tried to hoard or whether they took just a little bit, each person had enough and not more or less than what they needed, according to the story. Learn to live on enough. These resources and supplies of God are not to be hoarded, not used to create wealth for you and starvation for another. They are to be shared and cherished. So water from a rock. This one got me, even more than the aphids. Mostly because I'm completely unscientific in the way that I interpret everything. I'm learning. So it reads to my unscientific mind like another big drama. Like Moses hits a rock and a river comes gushing forth out of this rock, and everybody is able to satiate their need and fill their water skins and keep marching through the desert for another day. However, yet again we see sustenance come from ordinary places. Sedimentary rock is known, apparently, news to me, to feature pockets where water can collect just below the surface. If there is some seepage, so if you can see some drips or a bit of water coming out of the rock, you know that that is quite likely where one of these pockets exist, and by breaking through the surface of the rock, you can release the water beneath. Now, would one of these pockets be enough to satiate an entire nation? Probably not. Could this be the case of a dramatic miracle where God does provide that gushing river that I've so often pictured in my mind? Possibly. But also it could be Moses teaching the people how to use rocks and the resources around them in the desert to find water to drink. While I am a believer in miracles, feel free to fight me on that later, I tend to think that the latter is more plausible for this story, especially given the very natural and ordinary examples of the provision of God that this story seems to be building or framing into the narrative. Okay, that's a lot. We're okay? You're with me? Okay, great. So where is this leading? Where is the actual message for today in this? Because I'm probably not going to start eating aphid crap or hitting rocks, right? Like, that's not really a plausible, thing I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks. And so we have to look a little under the surface. And as always, when we do, there is so much more going on than we originally think or appreciate. And it is so real and so applicable to everything we face in our lives. Which leads me to the three tensions that I see in this passage. But first, a story about puppies. We'll get back. So when I was maybe 5, I'm going to say, I was desperate for a puppy. Can anyone relate to that? Is there a few? Yeah, okay, cool. And I started begging my parents for a puppy all of the time. I wanted a dog so badly that when I was probably about 7, and so we're consistent begging for 2 years at this point, my parents, maybe to try and get me off their back a little bit, I don't know, promised me that at a future point in time, when I was ready, they would get me a puppy. I wore them down. But if their goal was to make me shut up about begging for a dog and sit content, trusting that they would fulfill their promise in good time and when they knew I was ready because they know better than me and are more mature and they're the adults in this relationship after all, if that was their expectation, they failed quite badly. I doubled down. The promise of a dog only made the desperation to get one all the more potent. My parents were looking for some sign that I had matured enough or was old enough to care for an animal before getting the dog, and I know that because they explicitly said as much to me. But that just meant I was endlessly frustrated and annoyed, and in many ways, lacking the very maturity they were looking for in order to fulfill that promise. Well, eventually we did get one. I was probably about 10, I think. And it turns out, surprise, surprise, when someone fulfills a promise to you, not always, but often it comes with responsibility. For the first 2 weeks, I had to sleep by the dog's side and kind of settle it into the house. That was utterly delightful. It was the most responsible I'd ever felt, and it was so great. Turns out the other parts of looking after dogs are a little less delightful. Learning to discipline a dog when you just want to have fun and play with it. Pesky things like feeding schedules when, hey, I've got my whole life to live over here. Poo collection. Let's just say my parents probably took on a lot more of that responsibility than they hoped, although probably the exact amount they expected. And I, having received the dog I had spent the better part of 5 years begging for, started to whine and whinge and complain about the very chores required of looking after the thing that I had been promised. So bringing that back to Exodus, I essentially see 3 core tensions in the story. The people are living between the promise and the fulfillment is tension number 1. And in that space, they have a mindset of deep scarcity. Much like me thinking my entire life was incomplete without a dog, they had this promised land that was this abundant place flowing with milk and honey that they had been talking about and was a part of the legend that they believed they were walking towards as a nation. But in the desert, they have aphid crap and birds, and they have to break rocks just to have a drink. And so they feel scarce. But actually there is enough. Soon they will have access to the promised land, but abundance as a fulfilled promise comes with responsibility. There are instructions over the coming chapters and books that are given to the people around how part of that responsibility when you have abundance of resource is to care for the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner in your midst. Indeed, also to care for the very land. There was an entire system built around when and how the land Sabbaths, which is something that we don't really even think about in today's world. Ensuring that rather than leaning into greed and sucking all of the life out of the resource available to them, it is properly rested and able to feed and support generations for millennia into the future. And so in between promise and fulfillment, the people complain about the lack of abundance while God teaches them how to share and live from a sense of enough. There's an interesting contrast here too, I think, between the other story of, or one of the other stories of God giving people meat and bread. In the desert, the Israelites really did have enough, and they needed to learn to share and be content with that enough. So God teaches subsistence. But in the New Testament, Jesus sits with a crowd of people who have nothing. There are 5 pieces of bread and 2 pieces of fish to share between thousands. And Jesus does something completely different in that story. He multiplies that bread and fish so that everyone eats their fill and there are 12 baskets left over. Where there is enough, God teaches us subsistence and care for the resource we are responsible for. Where real scarcity exists, God invites us to a feast. I love that. And I think it kind of teaches us how to interact with our world a little bit too. Many of us have an abundance of resource and ought to probably think pretty seriously about how we choose to spend and exercise that resource. But where there is scarcity, where there is need, we should throw feasts that lead to overflow. So the second tension, fighting between trust and greed. A trust that God will provide, or a greed to hoard beyond what we need. The people are learning, or God is trying to teach them to live with enough. God says, look around you, there is enough. There's enough resource. You can find water in the desert. There is food here for you. And but you simply need to see it. But then the problem with greed is that it leads to missing out on the blessing of the promise. If we all trust there is enough, and if we take responsibility for our part in the sharing of resource, we find we're all better for it. If we choose greed, we squander the promise. So what was the conclusion of the dog story? Well, I was a self-interested little idiot. I was also a teenage boy, so like a little bit of grace. But did my parents hate me for that? No, not at all. They loved me and guided and cared for me like they were going to anyway. But the net outcome of this was that Dad had the best relationship with that dog in the entire world. Dad was that dog's human like no other human could be. And because I wasn't willing to take part in the responsibility and the care of the dog, I missed out on being that person for the dog, which also meant that I missed out on probably 50 to 60% of the blessing I would have had in the deeper, more meaningful connection with that dog. By not being responsible to tend and care for the promise that was fulfilled in my life, I missed out on its greatest blessing. And God tries to teach the people of Israel that lesson without the pain of having to learn it the hard way. But what did they do? Well, much like all of us, I think, they chose to squander the blessing. When they reached the promised land, they didn't ultimately trust that there was enough. And they did start to hoard resource. And by choosing not to trust that there was enough to go around, they ultimately ended up playing politics and fighting wars and choosing greed and creating the own setting for their demise. It wasn't a demise forever, and God still carries and holds and leads through all of it. But they found themselves in exile with their own prophets writing, one of the reasons you're in exile is because you refused to wrest the land. And now it's going to take all of the break that it needs to be restored back to where it ought to be. I think one could easily make the case we do the same thing in so many ways in our world and in our lives today. Not learning from the lessons of the past, whether we is me, us, our society, or something more, choose greed, and greed ultimately leads to downfall. The final tension, striving between hope and despair. I think this is almost like the character study of Moses part of this story. I think Moses really felt a lot of despair trying to lead the people of Israel, especially when there was those moments of complaint or those moments of choosing greed over trust, I think he struggled not to feel despair. And there's plenty of points in the story where he kind of fights God on that. And we too may struggle at different points in time not to despair as we look at our world. As we look at how collectively we seem to vote in politicians time and time again whose interest is more in greed and more in propping up the wealthy and building systems of economic gain than it is in caring for the earth and the marginalized. More interested in greed than it is for creating systems and economies of enough so that we all may have what we need. I think despair comes easy. Striving for hope is hard. But we must. And we need to know where, for each of us, and it may be a different place, but where it is that we actually put that hope. We have to trust and hope that there are still people who are striving for the world we believe God is building. To believe that we can choose to live from a sense of enough, that we don't need to push others down to get ahead, and perhaps even more difficult, to believe that when we do that and we do choose to live from a sense of enough, that we don't end up missing out on something as a result. We have to have hope in the God that is hope itself. Hope that God is still love, that God still holds God's creation and will never let us go. Must have hope that as we make these decisions to live from enough in our own lives and in our small pockets of community, that we will inspire others to do the same. And as that grows, there will be resource enough, not that we miss out on anything, but that by choosing to live that way, we actually create the margin needed to have parties where there is scarcity and to throw feasts where there is need.